2000 was a big year. You had the Y2K apocalypse, you had the scandal of the 2000 presidential election, and most importantly, Dungeons & Dragons had a revolution. And it's pretty much agreed. 2000, with the introduction of 3rd edition, is when the old school D&D was replaced by something else. Now, what is old school gaming versus new school? There is a thriving old school renaissance that publishes retro clones of Dungeons & Dragons and also other RPGs that are inspired by the same style of gameplay that these older editions fostered. The old school didn't die, it's alive and well. And what was that old school? Well, the most famous explanation of it is a free PDF you can all find online called A Quick Primer for Old School Gaming, put out by Matt Finch of Mythmere Games, which publishes Swords and Wizardry, an old school Renaissance D&D clone. It goes further into detail, but the main things they point out about old school D&D play as opposed to the new school is that you have rulings, not rules. Player skill, not character abilities, matter to your success. You are heroic, but not a superhero. And game balance is not a thing. And I, the rules lawyer, would like to add a couple of other things on the list, that modes of play that were popular in old school D&D are less popular since, namely dungeon delving and also stronghold and kingdom play. D&D 3rd edition made revolutionary changes to D&D that moved away from that play style. It set in motion trends in D&D and now also Pathfinder RPG, which derives from D&D, that continue to this day. But how and why did these changes come about? What exactly did 3rd edition do that made it the Rubicon? The main part of this video will go over the top 10 changes to the rules in 3rd edition. And the final thoughts, I'll talk about the long-lasting effects that these had on the game. But first, to introduce myself, I am Ronald, the rules lawyer. I am a lawyer who runs tabletop games. This is a video I've wanted to do for a while. I grew up in the 1980s and read the Red Box and D&D 1st edition, never got a chance to play them. And it was only in the year 2010 with 1st edition Pathfinder that I actually started playing the game. So it was after the revolution this video talked about. And Pathfinder comes from D&D, and it has fascinated me, the evolution of the game from then until now. I will link to the growing playlist that I will have on the history of Dungeons & Dragons. I already have a video on OD&D from 1974, and I did another video looking at how old school D&D possibly did the Martial caster balance better. Subscribe and ring the bell if you want to be notified about the next videos. Also support my Patreon. I don't make money as a lawyer. If that doesn't make sense, watch this video here, and you get early access to many of my videos and exclusive content. First, a brief history on what led to D&D 3rd edition. In the 1990s, D&D had declined, and TSR, the company that published D&D, almost went into bankruptcy. A new company, Wizards of the Coast, bought up TSR and the D&D IP. Other tabletop role-playing games like Vampire the Masquerade had emerged. Other forms of gaming, including video games, had become more popular, and D&D needed a revamping. Unlike the change from 1st to 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which involved a reorganization and some incremental changes, the change from 2nd to 3rd involved a from-the-ground-up redesign. What previously had been a cobbling together of various rules that had been relatively unchanged since 1974 became systematized. And there were a number of significant changes to the game, and I'll now go over the 10 biggest ones. The first changes I'll go over can be grouped together under the label character customization, and collectively they have a profound effect on the way the game is played. With 2nd edition AD&D, your character options were pretty limited. Once you chose your character's race and class, there were a few other things that you could do mechanically to make your character more distinct. One person's fighter would be almost identical to the next person's fighter. In contrast, modern D&D and Pathfinder, and I'll show a screenshot from the new player core book that just came out, emphasize character customization. Now, 3rd edition wasn't the first edition of D&D that tried to give more options beyond race and class. Actually, 2nd edition was kind of bursting at the seams in the 90s. They released player options books called The Complete Fighter, The Complete Wizard, that gave you kits to further customize your character. And you had the Skills and Powers book and other options books, which collectively some people call Edition 2.5. However, the customization they presented was limited by the structure of race and class that existed at the time. This would all be blown wide open by 3rd edition. So the first top change that they did was to remove racial class restrictions. Before, in 2nd edition, if you were not a human, you were what was called a demi-human. You were elf, dwarf, gnome, or halfling. And you were limited in how high you could progress in your class. These level limits from 2nd edition were actually more generous than those from 1st edition, but limits they were nevertheless. If you wanted to be a paladin, you had to be a human. No one else could be a paladin. If you were a halfling and wanted to be a fighter, you could only advance up to 9th level. And if you wanted to be a wizard, you were out of luck. 3rd edition removed racial class restrictions entirely. Sure, there were some races that had some advantages for certain classes, like being an elf wizard, but if you were a dwarf, you could be a paladin now, and if you were a halfling, you could be a wizard. Modern D&D and Pathfinder have never looked back. They have not gone to these old restrictions, which were justified at the time as a way to explain why humans were the predominant race in the campaign setting. Given the fact that demi-humans lived much longer than humans, there needed to be some explanation why they didn't become simply the most powerful creatures on the planet. That kind of simulationism, by the way, characteristic of wargaming, which is what D&D came from, has become less of a concern to modern D&D players and game masters. The second top change was that 3rd edition brought unlimited multiclassing. Previously, multiclassing was the exclusive domain of demi-humans, and you could only multiclass in certain combinations depending on your race. You divided your experience points between the classes, and there was a mishmash of rules explaining what you could and could not do with your combination of classes. Humans could have more than one class, however, they had to go through a process called dual classing, which was very hard to qualify for. You needed very high ability scores, and it involved abandoning your first class and not doing anything from that class for a period of time, or else it would endanger your advancement in the new class. It was kind of janky. Both of these options limited you to 2 classes with a few exceptions. 3rd edition blew all of this wide open and made character creation kind of like a toy box. All the classes provided levels that you can stack onto your character like building blocks without limitation. You started with one class at first level, but with every new class, you could stack a level from any of the other classes on top of it. And 3rd edition also added prestige classes that had prerequisites for you to take levels from those. You could take a new class every level, like the famous Absurd. It appears that the old way of making classes had a couple of reasons. First, to make demi-humans more attractive as races to play, since they have those level limitations, but also as a way to balance the game, to make sure that every class's abilities were siloed so that you couldn't just freely take from other classes. It made it easier to balance marshals versus casters, for example. For a full video talking about how they balance casters in old school D&D, see the video on the screen. I'll link to it in the description. But yes, both D&D and Pathfinder in their own different ways have abandoned the old way and now prioritize freedom to take from different classes. Number 3 is that skills are now core to the game. We now have a way with 3rd edition for all character classes to be able to improve in a commonly shared set of skills. There were a few exceptions, but in the vast majority of these skills, and yes, there were a lot of skills in 3.0 D&D, anyone could spend points in them. There's a lot more to say about skills that I'll save for later, but the point right now is that skills were another way for you to customize your character. We also see a breaking down of walls. Before, only certain races could detect secret doors or detect special features in a dungeon. And only rogues had abilities that could find and disable traps. Those things now become something that anyone of any race in any class can get better at. These skills also have non-combat uses, things like deciphering script, knowledge, more ways for your character to improve doing things that are not just hitting things harder or casting spells. The fourth thing that 3rd edition did was introduce feats. Now, these are new, but also kind of not new. 2nd edition had a book called Skills and Powers, which let you spend points to choose abilities within your class, and also some other things. But what you got was pretty much limited to optional class features. The designers then asked themselves, well, what if we gave everybody a feat at 1st level and another every 3rd level? And anybody could take these. Some of them will have prerequisites, but being a certain class won't necessarily wall you off from them. This is the list of feats that were in 3.0. And oh, how quaint this list is. It's so small compared to what will come with future books. But feats offered a whole set of ways basically to break the rules or to bend the rules. This had 3 effects. First, one fighter could be very different from the next fighter. You can choose different feats that activated different martial abilities. Second, the game could create pretty powerful and amazing abilities that had prerequisites or required higher level. What martial character did not want to get Great Cleave and the possibility of making unlimited attacks in a round? Third, it broke down the barriers between classes. Before, if you were a fighter, you couldn't cast spells. If you were a wizard, you could not use armor or wield the vast majority of weapons. Now, you could get armor proficiency or weapon proficiency through feats. A fighter could get the Monk's Stunning Fist ability. And back to skills from earlier, any fighter could get the Use Magic Device skill, at least with 3.5 edition, to activate magical items that cast spells. Feats are now replete in every edition of D&D and Pathfinder since 5th edition made them optional, but they're coming back in the next edition because they're so popular. People have wanted to customize their characters beyond just race and class. As you can see, we are moving away from the idea from the old school primer of player skill instead of character abilities. Many people prefer that style, but many other people also prefer being able to make mechanical choices that make your character unique and awesome. I went through these parts of character customization first because they have ripple effects throughout the rest of 3rd edition and the future of D&D, which I think the rest of this video will show. The next changes I put under the category of power increase. Now that you're customizing your character and spending more time building your character, and that especially became truer as more books were released that had more options, then players and game masters were going to be less open to characters dying from a random die roll. Simply roll up a new character is going to be less appealing when you put a lot of work crafting each character, which can also make you feel more invested in them. There are 3 key things I'm going to point out that are part of this power increase. First, greater survivability. Before 3rd edition, a 1st level character was not very different from your typical commoner. Here I'll show the rules from the 2nd edition Dungeon Master's Guide for hit points for non-player characters. Your typical human would have 1 to 6 hit points. This meant that wizards who had 1d4 hit points were weaker than a youth and about as tough as an invalid. Even a level 1 fighter who starts with 1d10 hit points will have on average 1 more hit point than a manual laborer. And before 3rd edition, the core rule was that you die at 0 hit points. When a character reaches 0 hit points, that character is slain. And remember, you rolled your 1st level hit points. A fighter could start with 1. Meanwhile, in 3rd edition, you get your full hit die of hit points at level 1. And now an optional rule from the 2nd edition books becomes core. You entered negative hit points and stayed alive so long as you did not reach negative 10. You lose a single hit point every round until somebody can help you. Now, this existed as an optional rule in 2nd edition, but it was hidden in the Dungeon Master's Guide, not in the player book. And also, parties tended to have more tools to bring them back up. Clerics now had cantrips and could prepare 3 instances of Cure Minor Wounds. Also gone was the old optional rules proviso that you were pretty much done adventuring for the day if ever you got knocked out. Also, scary monster abilities were nerfed. In 2nd edition, a large spider with 1 hit die could poison a character, and if they failed their saving throw versus poison, they would take 15 points of damage. 15 hit points would kill you, And for many characters, you had a less than 50-50 chance of succeeding on your save. In 3rd edition, poison from that same spider would do damage to one of your ability scores at most 2 times. And if a score reached 0, you didn't die, you were just in a helpless state, the one exception being Constitution, which almost none of these were. Another ability that got nerfed was the infamous Energy Drain. The white wraiths, vampires, specters, if they scored a successful hit against you, drained a level of experience. A level, one that probably took you months of playing the game to achieve, and you had no saving throw. The undead were scary in old school D&D. With 3rd edition, they remained kind of scary. You lost a level. You had a chance to get it back, essentially, with a saving throw after 24 hours. This gets weakened progressively with every new edition of D&D and Pathfinder. So in 3rd edition, you had full hit points for that first hit die, and there was a much greater likelihood you would make it to 2nd level. You came in with the expectation that you might become a hero who will do great things, and that to some extent you already are that hero. Not somebody who's just a tiny step above a regular old schmo. The original D&D game was made in the 1970s, and its expectation of death lived on through the 80s and the 90s. Now, this is a whole fascinating topic in itself. I don't know if there are essays or videos about this, but gaming was a casual affair at this time. Arcade games were short affairs lasting a few minutes, maybe more. They were supposed to kill you. Home video games also tended to be short. Board games were also casual affairs in which you might just be eliminated early in the game. You were happy if you could keep playing, basically. The point of many games was to not die. That was the game. And in the case of Monopoly, utterly destroy your opponents, but that's another matter. The next thing 3rd edition did is what I call flipping the curve, and you'll see what I mean. They gave exponential growth to characters. In 2nd edition, your advancement leveled off. In 2 ways. First, the amount of experience you needed for each new level tended to double. That continued until you reached what players called name level. In the case of the fighter, it was 9th level. And it was called name level because there used to be level titles. This is a screenshot from 1st edition AD&D. Every level was given a title, and you eventually reached some great name. In the case of the fighter, you became a lord. What also changed was that your hit dice, and you were getting 1 every level, stopped going up after you reached name level. You stopped gaining a lot of hit points, and also a lot of the game's effects keyed off of the number of hit dice you have. And once you reached name level, and this was a class feature for many of the classes, you were able to settle down and get a stronghold that attracted followers. Megan, sit on my lap already. It is your destiny. It was a kind of retirement, and the expectation was that you would be involved in bigger matters than mere dungeon delving and attacking things on your own. You were now a leader, and tending to political matters as well. This shows the wargaming roots of D&D. Also, after name level, many classes stopped gaining new abilities. Their basic math might improve gradually, but there usually wasn't a whole lot to look forward to. The spellcasters, of course, got their new levels of spells. But for most characters, you had this idea of leveling off, and I learned while researching this video, it's called logarithmic growth. Improvements come quickly in the beginning, but your gains decrease over time. 3rd edition gave you rules to continually gain abilities up through 20th level. You're always gaining new hit dice, 1 every level, and they embraced the idea that you should have something to look forward to within your class all the way up to 20th level. Fighters could continue to get bonus feats, and there were higher level bonus feats that you looked forward to. Rogues' extra sneak attack damage went up to plus 10d6. And the casters, of course, got their spell levels, and all casters in 3rd edition got 9th level spells. Clerics and druids had been limited to 7th level spells before. Characters were expected to continually improve, and this is shown by how 3rd edition calculated experience points. CR stood for challenge rating. A CR 13 creature was an appropriate challenge for a 13th level party, and it earned them 3,900 experience points. Go 2 CRs up, and facing a challenge that's appropriate for a party 2 levels higher, you see that the experience point award is doubled. This pattern continues throughout. The idea was that, in theory, a character doubles in power every 2 levels, and this stays true in this chart through 20th level. This is an example of an exponential growth curve, and this has profound changes on the setting. First, gone is the idea that you achieve some summit of ability as a humanoid. There is no upper limit separating you in the campaign setting from eventually achieving the power of the greatest monsters. And if you want to say, well, there were some monsters above 20th level, well, 3rd edition released something called the Epic Level Handbook to let you reach 30th level. And yes, there are some monsters above 30th level, but the idea was that the ceiling was busted open. Before, there was the idea of some upper limit that you could achieve, and that those ancient red dragons, greater demons, were some tier above. But the exponential growth in 3rd edition meant that that very high-level fighter could possibly solo an ancient red dragon or Baylor demon. Also gone is the idea of settling down, building a stronghold, and being a ruler among mortal affairs. 3rd edition on release did not have rules for strongholds. You're no longer aspiring to be a great lord of your kingdom or a big power player within the campaign setting. The rules are now encouraging you and enabling you to be somewhat of a demigod, someone who can take on legendary creatures. And the possibility that you might become a demigod, assuming your GM has not set a level limit to your campaign, is there from the beginning when you create that character. And that fosters a very different mindset, a different set of expectations for players. And the 7th big change, and this may surprise some, is that 3rd edition buffed spellcasters. Now, it'll be surprising because the makers of D&D, and it was well known in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, were that spellcasters outclassed marshals after the early levels. Spells just ruled, and it could change reality. That's always been true since the origins of the game. Also, 3rd edition was supposed to address problems that plagued D&D, and the martial caster divide had been a source of many nerd arguments then, just as it is today. I won't go over this in detail here. My recent video on spellcasting and old school D&D does, but suffice it to say that the spells remained very powerful and reality-changing in 3rd edition, but the ability of spellcasters to have the right tool at the right time increased, and to be able to cast it without negative consequences. Spellcasters got more spells, wizards were able to choose their spells. I go over all that in that video. This buffing of spellcasters I don't think was intended by the 3rd edition designers, and it was part of this significant power increase that we see with this edition. So these factors combine in 3rd edition to take the game from the old school style of being heroic but not being superheroes to being superheroes. The next big change is that there is an effort to balance the game. Since players are now putting more effort, because they can, into making distinctive customized characters, there was now this simultaneous effort to make it so that the party doesn't randomly die. 3rd edition uses the term challenge rating and assigns a challenge rating to each monster, and says that a monster of a certain CR is an appropriate challenge for a group of characters of that same level number. This assigning of a number for this purpose is new. Before, in 2nd edition, monsters had hit dice, yes, and that was a measure of their strength. However, there was a wide variety of special abilities, some of which could instantly kill you, even in a low-level creature, or drain your energy, as we just saw, that you couldn't really create an encounter balancing system around numbers. 3rd edition, like many things it did, wanted to bring system where there was vagueness before. One of the things it did to be able to assign a strength rating to monsters was to make uniform how they built monsters, and also make it comparable to how they built player characters. They, in fact, use a lot of the player character building rules to build monsters. Here on the screen are 3rd edition water elementals grouped by size, and as they gain more hit dice, if you think of them as character levels, you see that they're actually gaining feats at a comparable rate that player characters would be gaining feats. They also had guidelines, one would think, of how many hit points and what kind of armor class and saving throws would a creature of this CR have. Hence all of their numbers going up systematically the more hit dice they gain. This also, by the way, has the side effect of making many high-level monsters and especially high-level NPCs unwieldy to run, but that's a whole other issue that's not part of this video. Another thing that's significant going on with 3rd edition at the same time is the removal of rules for morale. In 2nd edition, the goal was not necessarily to have a straight-up fight with a group of monsters. It was to defeat them psychologically, make them run away, make them surrender. What you're looking at is a list of guidelines for game masters to use for when to check against morale, and every monster had a morale score that you would roll dice against. And there was a chart of many modifiers that could change that die roll. This would work even when logic and circumstances might suggest that the monsters have an upper hand against the party. So the mindset, the style of game that the 3rd edition designers were thinking of now was one of more, you go up to those enemies, you confront them, and you beat them. So you now have a different mindset. Before 3rd edition, you created a challenge and then the players had to deal with it. And if somebody died, they died. But now the mindset is, now that we're allowing players to make unique, customized characters, now that they're looking forward to cool powers when they level up, well, let's not accidentally kill them. Let's have tools for the game master to create whatever difficulty of an encounter you want. This practice of giving tools to game masters to balance encounters, tune them, lives on through all of the subsequent editions of D&D and Pathfinder. I'll save more comments on this to the end, but there's now an expectation that game masters will balance encounters, whereas the old school primer says, forget game balance if you're playing an old school game. Next are a set of things, changes to the rules that change the culture around the game and how people approached rules, period, in D&D. First is that 3rd edition systematized and cleaned up many rules. In 2nd edition, thieves had percentage chances of success to do a variety of things. You rolled a d100 and tried to roll that number or lower. The strength table had you roll a d20 to reach a number or lower to succeed at opening doors. Rolling a saving throw involved rolling a d20 and matching a number or higher. Also, by the way, these categories had a lot of overlap and it was not always clear which column you should roll under. And of course, there is the infamous FACO. Armor class got stronger the lower your armor class was. So characters had a stat that stood for to hit armor class 0, which amounted to giving you a goal number like saving throws, but you added your opponent's armor class to your d20 roll. It was a motley group of systems, each one different from the other. To replace all this, 3rd edition created a single universal mechanic, very familiar to those today, and this will show you how groundbreaking it was, 3rd edition. It's so familiar. You roll a d20 and add a modifier and try to reach a target number. This is ubiquitous. This is what you roll to try to hit something. This is what you roll to try to succeed on a skill check. This is what you roll to try to succeed on a saving throw. It all sounds straightforward, but it does mean a complete redesign of all the math and all the numbers. The occasion of a new edition made that possible. Number 10 is codification. There was a lot of vagueness and a lot of room for GMs to make calls, rulings, not rules, as we heard from the old school primer. A lot of that now gets filled out by rules in 3rd edition. I'll show an excerpt on the screen from 2nd edition describing how to run combat. It first describes 4 steps to be done in order. Each side decides what they're going to do, then you roll initiative, and then you resolve them. However, it also says, the above sequence is not immutable. You don't have to adhere to this. Indeed, some monsters violate the standard sequence, and some situations demand the application of common sense. In these cases, the DM's word is final. We'll get back to this example in a moment, but another thing is how AD&D treated experience points. Now, I thought experience points were based on treasure you found. By the time we got to 2nd edition, which was published in 1989, they had kind of moved beyond that. It was now more based on vibes. And okay, basing XP on treasure was also based on vibes. The game master had to determine how much treasure to give and decide what the rate of advancement would be. So there really wasn't a change. This was how you did XP. It says there was no magical formula. Only time, instinct, and player reactions will tell. 2E says how much XP comes from monsters, but it also says reward characters for fun, character survival and improvement, and also reward for story goals. And the most concrete advice it gives beyond that is a little paragraph that says an average pace in an AD&D game campaign is considered to be 3 to 6 adventures per level. However, it is possible to advance as quickly as 1 level per adventure or as slowly as 10 or more. So this truly was a domain up to every individual game master. Now, it's hard to imagine a modern rule system leaving such a core part of the game completely up to the GM, though what 5th edition does with magic item prices, I would say, is comparable. Now we expect definite rules for a combat sequence and definite rules for how much experience points to award. This is the chart from the 3rd edition Dungeon Master's Guide on how much experience every monster will give depending on party level. Also with 3rd edition, it's not easy to show with screenshots, but the amount of experience you got from defeating monsters was the vast majority of the experience you earned, so it gave you a guidepost on how quickly you should level up. This provided consistency from table to table. As a player, you had a general idea of how often you were supposed to level up. This codification extends to combat, of course, as well. In 2nd edition, players give a general indication of what their characters are planning to do. That language shows how general and open-ended action declaration was. You could kind of do anything, and there weren't necessarily rules for what you did. And it's not really laid out how many things you can do on your turn also. Well, 3rd edition gives a lot more definition. First, it defines a lot of things that you can do and has rules for them. And it also does what is now familiar to modern players. It groups actions into types. It has standard actions, which you can say is the main thing on your turn, like attacking or casting a spell, and then move equivalent actions. So you can either move or open a door. Those are counterposed, and they're the same type of action that can be exchanged for each other. You also have defined full round actions and free actions. Now, some people may point out that 2nd edition had an optional book called Combat and Tactics, which had a lot of these rules in a nascent form, but that was an optional book, and it was with 3rd edition that it became core. But as you can see, this means a lot of uniformity between tables. There's no ambiguity that you cannot dismiss a spell and strike with a weapon in the same turn, because those are both using up your one standard action. And there are rules for a lot of these actions. This includes combat maneuvers, things like disarm and trip. Now, there were lots of rules tucked away around things like disarming and tripping foes in AD&D. However, a lot of them honestly were, I think, not followed because they were next to other rules that were not followed. There's something about how 3rd edition clearly had a conscious design and that these rules were meant to be adhered to, and people did make an effort to adhere to them. This codification in rules characterizes every subsequent edition of D&D and Pathfinder. Now, 5th edition does walk back on this a bit to have fewer rules and in the spirit of letting GMs figure stuff out. But even 5th edition, compared to old school, is more codified, relying less on that common sense that 2E talked about. All right, number 11, and those of you who follow my channel know that I can never limit myself to 10. And that is individual initiative. Now, this could have fallen under codification. My lawyer brain wanted to put it under there, but I felt that this was important enough to give it its own number. And this is a real mindset difference. People who play D&D and Pathfinder today expect to take turns. They expect to roll initiative and have your character put in some list and wait in line. And by the way, there are other systems that are popular nowadays, like Powered by the Apocalypse, where combat is more of a conversation and the order of events is improvised. But we're talking about D&D and Pathfinder. So let's look at that 2E passage again and look at this example. It goes through the procedure. First, the DM secretly decides that some orcs will fall back and let the trolls fight. Next, the players together generally indicate what they are going to do this round. Harry, playing Wrath, a dwarf who hates orcs. Orcs, charge! Anne, playing Delzanora, the mage. What? Wait, don't do that. I was going to... Now I can't use a fireball. DM, Wrath is charging forward. Quick, what are you doing? John, playing Rupert the half-elf, tells Anne, "Cast a spell!" Tells the DM, "Can I fire my bow over him?" DM, "Sure, he's short." John, "Okay, I'll shoot at orcs." DM, "Anne, tell me what Delsinore's doing or she'll lose the round trying to make up her mind." Anne, "Got it. Acid arrow spell at the lead troll." DM, "Fine. Harry, Wrath is in front. Roll for initiative." So, as you can see, the idea here is that everything's happening simultaneously. There is no "I hold my charge until after Fireball is cast." And they also are forced to say what they're going to do before initiative is rolled. And initiative by default in 2E is group initiative. One side does all of its actions before the other side. So let's say they did not do this and worked out that Anne would cast a fireball on those enemies. However, they might lose initiative, and those enemies might run up and mix themselves up with the party before the player actually does get to cast fireball. Now, I must say, this is one of the more exciting things that makes me want to try out old school play. There's just something more realistic about it, but I also think there are strengths to the modern way. And what's the modern way? So in 3rd edition, many of you will be familiar with this, everyone rolls initiative, individual initiative, and then the DM puts everyone in order. And a lot of monsters are grouped together for this purpose. And then, even though in the fiction everything is happening simultaneously, that isn't how the game is resolved. Everyone does stand still in the game while somebody else moves around them or does other things. Now, there's some preservation of simultaneity in reactions, things like attack of opportunity or damage that disrupts a spell that's being cast. However, it's pretty much everyone is in their own time bubble. And by the way, I will comment that this is one of the ways in which spellcasters get buffed, because before they had to declare beforehand, and a single point of damage against them would disrupt their spell. But yeah, turn-based initiative lives on in all subsequent versions of D&D and Pathfinder, and it has its own strengths. It makes combat a more deliberate and tactical affair. It's less realistic, possibly less immersive. It's more of a game, and many people want to play more of the game. Turn-based initiative allows for more intricate tactics. What you do on your turn might change based on what's changed since your last turn. And since you have more customizable characters that have more abilities, you now have more time to mull over your options. And again, one is not necessarily better than the other. It's comparable to the divide between turn-based video games and real-time ones. Each tickles a different part of the brain. And here is when we go back to point number 3 from earlier, skills. We have in 3rd edition what I call the skills revolution. This already existed in a nascent form in 2nd edition, where you had non-weapon proficiencies. You were able to be good at several things that were not just combat. However, the system was relatively crude compared to what came after. You rolled a d20 and tried to roll a number or lower. I'll put up on the screen the jump non-weapon proficiency, which gave some workable rules, which, by the way, did not yet have the uniformity of the d20 system in 3rd edition. They were all kind of ad hoc. But what we see here is less than what we get in 3rd edition. Here's the jumping skill in 3rd edition. In fact, and there's just not enough screenshots I can show you, there's just many rules inserted into 3rd edition that make clear that they're trying to emulate a fantasy reality. I'll show an excerpt of the search skill, which gives definite difficulty classes, DCs, for doing certain things. There's less room here for the GM to just make something up. Largely, I think, because there's this uniform mechanic of rolling a d20 and reaching a target number. And it was also kind of easier to find the DCs and rules for things the way skills were organized in the 3rd edition player's handbook. People tended to follow these rules, or try to. Meanwhile, the skills pretty much embraced everything you could do that was not swinging a weapon or casting a spell. Remember, a lot of the abilities that used to be the domain of thieves and rogues, disable device, hide, move silently, climb, were now applied to every character. Skills now governed what happened outside of combat. This has a deep impact on how people play the game. And I'm going to show on the screen an excerpt from the old school primer. where basically the modern style of dealing with a pit trap involves rolling a perception check and a disarm check. However, in the old school style, it involved having a conversation. The TLDR is that they want to use a 10-foot pole to detect the trap, but they don't have one, and they pour water on the floor to see if water seeps into cracks outlining a trap. This also means that it's hard-coded through the rules that some characters are better than others at doing certain things because they have, for example, a better modifier. In old school D&D, you kind of assumed competency in many things from all characters, and it was up to the player to play that character, fictional character, well. This is what the old school primer meant by player skill, not character abilities. Another big change was conversations. You now have skills for diplomacy and bluff. Do you play out a conversation with an NPC or do you roll a d20? Now, this is something that has a lot of difference of opinion among different game masters. Some new school game masters may want to set these rules aside and run it the more old school way. But I'm focused on what the rules are actually saying in this video, which did enable a playstyle that we see very prevalent today in which skill checks determine a lot more outcomes. Okay, the 12th big change that 3rd edition brought is a magic item gold economy. There are now prices for magic items, and it assumes shops in larger settlements to buy them. And we have definite gold costs for crafting. You can take feats that allow you to craft magical items. This has a huge impact on the game in a few ways. The first is that there's now a definite, tangible thing you can use your gold for. Before, in earlier old school editions, gold was the source of most of your experience points. Beyond that, gold's value was determined by how your GM ran your world. You can use it to influence events, or you can build your stronghold. But now, because we no longer have rules for strongholds, and there are rules for improving your gear, that is definitely what, clearly, gold is for in 3rd edition. In fact, the prices that 3rd edition devised for these various items is paired with an expected wealth that characters of certain levels have. One could almost think of this as a second XP track that can improve your character's power. We are talking about getting straight up mathematical bonuses in your attack rolls and in your armor class from these items. And not shown here are cloaks of resistance, which can improve your saving throws. Now, one side effect of this is that magic items did become less wondrous because a significant part of your budget went toward improving your character's math, which is not the most exciting thing. Something called the Christmas tree problem that 5th edition wanted to solve by removing prices for magical items and designing parts of its system with the assumption that characters do not have magic items. But with 3rd edition and most of the editions of D&D and Pathfinder since, gold goes towards empowering your character. This, of course, has a long and rich history. Computer games, role-playing games, for many years by this point, gave you the opportunity to improve your character through spending the money you find. But 3rd edition, at least in a flagship RPG product, created a system where everything was theoretically available to you so long as you had enough money. If there are other TTRPGs that did this before 3rd edition, I'd be interested to know in the comments. But it's 3rd edition that introduced it in D&D. This reflects and also causes a couple of trends in gaming that are going on. One, this is another part of customizing your unique character that I talked about earlier. Magic items are not just found now, you can choose them. But also, second, this ability to customize your magic items along with customizing your character in 3rd edition meant the rise of the build. There is now a minigame, a very popular minigame of talking about and exchanging ideas of how to build a very strong character or interesting character. And there's many people who spend a significant amount of time, perhaps even more time with some folks, making characters than playing characters. All right, I'm actually done with my list, and I'm going to get to my final thoughts soon. One thing I did not include here that 3rd edition introduced that some may think I should have included is the open gaming license. That's a license that allowed third-party publishers to create content for D&D 3rd edition and also produce other derivative content, including other games. This had a huge effect on the industry and on the future of the hobby, but I didn't include it because I'm focused on the rules of 3rd edition and how that affected gameplay. Of course, it is the OGL that has enabled the old school Renaissance to thrive as much as it has, since publishers have been able to produce their own versions of older editions of Dungeons & Dragons. Ronald from the future here. My final thoughts are 20 minutes long, and this video was already too damn long, so I put them in a part 2. I also thought that the 2 parts could each stand on their own. So see you in the next video.